Welcome to tonight's meeting of the Oxford Communist Correspondence Society. The topic tonight is Victorian Seances and Marx's law of value. We'll start with an introductory talk which will be given by Ian. There will then be an opportunity for questions and then plenty of time for discussion. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks everyone for coming. I hope everyone had a nice Halloween. Unfortunately, we couldn't give this talk precisely on Halloween, but it is something of a ghost story that I'm going to tell. And like all good ghost stories, it is a true story. So, in the early 1980s, my grandparents lived in a small council flat on the 8th floor of a high-rise tower block in Sheffield. And occasionally at family gatherings in their home, but only when pestered, they would reluctantly fetch what my grandmother called her gypsy table. And the gypsy table was a small wooden table with a circular top, about waist high, with space for at most a teapot and a couple of cups. It had 3 turned legs that were arranged in a tripod for stability. But this wasn't an ordinary table because it was a magical table. And it was magical because it could host spirits. And to evoke a spirit, 2 or more people would place their hands upon it, linked as in a seance, but standing rather than sitting. And then one of my grandparents would speak aloud into the ether and invite a spirit to join us. And we'd all fall quiet in anticipation, looking at the table for any signs of life. Spirit, show us a sign if you are there. And there would be silence, everything would be still. Spirit, we await you, my grandmother would say, and nothing would happen. But then, almost imperceptibly, the gypsy table would stir and slowly, very slowly, rock back on 2 of its tripod legs, raise its third, and then slowly rock forward to resume its rest position. And then the air was electric because the spirit had arrived. Now, humans have been summoning spirits into inanimate objects for millennia. The ancient Egyptians summoned Ka, which seems to have meant living breath, the Ka of dead ancestors into the body of a wooden statue. And the living would then parade the statues in festivals, so the dead, with their painted eyes wide open, could see the mortal world again. And newly crowned pharaohs, to prevent spiritual interference from dead political enemies, commanded that the noses of their statues be chopped off, because that would prevent the spirit from breathing, forcing the Ka to depart. But not just dead ancestors. Gods inhabited temple statues. So to maintain their divine presence, they were tended daily. And the priest would perform the ritual of opening of the mouth, and they would touch the statue's mouth, eyes, nose, and ears with ritual implements to give it the power of breath, sight, smell, and hearing. And on auspicious days, the temple priest placed the ensouled statue on a boat and sailed it along the Nile in full view of assembled crowds. And when the boat approached the riverbank, the worshippers gathered to ask the god questions and gain spiritual guidance. And the god, trapped in the statue, able to see and hear but not talk, communicated by rocking the boat on the water. The ancient Greeks maintained the presence of gods within their temples with animal sacrifices, prayer, and dedications. In the Iliad, petitioners ask the statue of Athena to save the city, but she declines by turning her head away. The Greek magical papyri, it's a collection of manuscripts dating from about 100 BC, contains several spells for ensouling statues. Neoplatonic theurgy, which is the system of magic developed by Iamblichus and his followers in late antiquity, that describes the practice of ensouling statues too. And the early Christian polemicist Tertullian, writing in the 2nd century AD, he reports disapprovingly of pagans conjuring spirits that communicate through the movement of stools and tables. So, although I didn't know it at the time, my grandparents and I were participating in an ancient practice. And once their gypsy table was ensouled, it could then answer questions. Rocking once for yes and twice for no. And we could ask it anything. It could foretell the future and it could reveal secrets. And if we were lucky, the table actually walked across the carpet floor by rocking back to raise a tripod leg, then rotating like an inclined wheel to place its legs back on the carpet a few inches further forward. Despite the evidence of our senses, most of us thought this was impossible. Wooden tables cannot walk, neither can they be possessed by unseen spirits. So the skeptics amongst us immediately asked my grandparents to remove themselves, as obviously they were moving the table with their hands. And yet, even when the skeptics removed themselves, the table still moved. I remember one family member of mine turning the table to inspect its underside to try and discover a hidden mechanism. I even tried it with my little sister. Just two young children linking their hands upon it. No one else had their hands upon the table. And we too felt and saw the table move. And therefore it was magic. Or was it? My grandmother claimed that her family had acquired the table from a travelling gypsy. As a child, I imagined a colourful horse-drawn caravan, a distant relative entering, and an illicit exchange with an old crone sitting within its shadows. But now, as an adult, I know something different. So, in the Victorian era, occasional tables with 3 legs were popular. And they were marketed as gypsy tables because they were small and easily transported. And this marketing also exploited the Victorian obsession with table tipping or table turning, which is a practice that seems to have originated, at least in modern times, in America's spiritualist movement. In 1848, the teenage Fox sisters, who were later to become infamous, reported poltergeist activity in their house in New York. And eyewitnesses reported tables spontaneously making knocking sounds, rocking back and forth, and even levitating many feet off the floor. And in 1849, the sisters publicly demonstrated table turning at the Corinthian Hall in New York. And this was a sensation, and the newspapers rapidly spread the word. Infant mortality was high, life expectancy was low, people were hungry for news from the spirit world to assuage their grief. And so quite naturally, people attempted to replicate the phenomenon in their home. And it worked. And so table turning became a craze which spread to England when an American medium advertised their travelling seances in the front pages of the Times. And within the year, table turning had become fashionable throughout the land. The upper classes held tea and table turning parties, while the lower classes commandeered tables from their kitchens. And even Queen Victoria and Prince Albert joined in. So England's tables were moving, animated by invisible ghosts or spirits. In fact, table turning was so popular that Marx and Engels mention it. Engels makes a passing reference to it in his Dialectics of Nature. And Marx mentions table turning in the first paragraph of his famous chapter on the fetishism of commodities. And so I'm going to quote it in full because it's going to be important for what we talk about later. So Marx says, "A commodity appears at first sight a very trivial thing and easily understood. Its analysis shows that it is in reality a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. So far as it is of value in use, there is nothing mysterious about it. It's as clear as noonday that man, by his industry, changes the forms of the materials furnished by nature in such a way as to make them useful to him. The form of wood, for instance, is altered by making a table out of it. Yet for all that, the table continues to be that common, everyday thing, wood. But so soon as it steps forth as a commodity, it is changed into something transcendent. It not only stands with its feet on the ground, but in relation to all other commodities, it stands on its head and evolves out of its wooden brain grotesque ideas far more wonderful than table turning ever was. That's the end of the quote. So, what is this change that occurs in the table as soon as it steps forth as a commodity? Well, a wooden table in the context of a market economy acquires new properties. The table may be exchanged for 100 loaves of bread, 1 engagement ring, 1.5 porcelain tea sets, and so on. The table, in other words, acquires the property of exchangeability, and the table's relative price represents those exchange ratios. But why do commodities have prices at all? So Marx points out that the activities of independent private producers must be coordinated. In a market economy, this is achieved by feedback in the form of transfers of money that flow in the opposite direction to the transfer of commodities. Activities in undersupply sell at higher prices and get rewarded with higher money rewards, and conversely, activities in undersupply sell at lower prices and get punished with lower money rewards. So the producers are therefore forced to switch from unprofitable to profitable activities. And the economy, therefore, in a spontaneous and unplanned manner, continually and roughly achieves a social division of labour that produces the correct quantities of commodities to meet monetary demand. Monetary demand, we shouldn't forget, however, is skewed horribly by class inequality. So although this division of labour succeeds in reproducing class society, it always fails to meet many real human needs. So far, so good. That's why commodities have prices at all. But why do some cost more than others? What determines their relative prices? And Marx, like the classical economists before him, understood that prices fluctuate with supply and demand. But what really needs explaining is the relatively stable structure of prices over longer periods of time. So why do planes always cost more than pens? Why do sofas typically cost about the same as computers? And Marx's answer is that in a capitalist economy, due to the competitive scramble for profits, prices tend towards, but never fully reach, an attractor state where they're proportional to the socially necessary labour time required to make them. And so in a hypothetical equilibrium state without profit and rent, and where supply perfectly equals demand, then prices will perfectly represent labour time. And Marx names this dynamic process the law of value. And so a plane almost always costs more than a pen because it always requires more labour time to make it compared to a pen. So, a wooden table acquires not one but two new properties when it steps forth as a commodity. An exoteric property, which is its exchange value or its price, and an esoteric property, which is its true value, which is the quantity of labour time to produce it, and which I'm going to call, for clarity from now on, its labour value. And a commodity's labour value is the hidden regulator of its market price. So, the wooden table acquires new properties, but why does Marx say that an ordinary table becomes transcendent? And why is this far more wonderful than table turning? So Marx, at least in translation, talks of labour value being embodied in commodities, and that commodities are merely congealed quantities of labour. But Marx also, at the same time, denies that labour value is literally and therefore physically embodied in commodities, like wine poured into a bottle. Marx also asserts that the labour value of an already produced wooden table, stored unsold in a warehouse, its labour value will change immediately if society adopts new labour saving techniques to make it. And Marx, I won't quote all the references for that, but it's actually very, very clear. Marx is very clear. The labour value of any commodity is the labour time that counterfactually would be used up if that commodity was produced right now, today. And that seems on the face of it like spooky action at a distance, because the unsold commodity sitting on a shelf hasn't changed at all. So the labour value of a commodity is indeed strange, even transcendent. During a table-turning séance, a spirit inhabits the body of the wooden table. The table therefore acquires a new property of being ensouled and the new power of communicating with people. The very same table, in the context of a market economy, also acquires a new property of being a labour value, with a new power of exchangeability with all other commodities. And in both cases, no matter how hard we look, even if we turn the table upside down, this way and that, we will never be able to see the spirit or the labour value hiding within it. These properties become, in some sense, embodied within the table, and yet in another sense are entirely absent, invisible to our senses. And just as the hidden spirit animates the table, its hidden labour value animates its price. As Marx writes, here's a quote, "The secret that makes all commodities exchangeable is now understood as a world of appearances of this ghostly objectivity called value." And sometimes that in translation is not translated as ghostly objectivity, sometimes it's phantom-like objectivity or spectral objectivity. So the ensouled table might appear wondrous, but a table as an economic value has a ghostly property that's equally real and unreal. And this magic is far more wonderful because it is far more powerful. In antiquity, belief in gods and spirits was widespread, whereas commodity production was sporadic and limited. But by the Victorian era, that situation had reversed. The emergence of capitalism and the scientific revolution meant that ancient beliefs in ensouling were no longer on the table, so to speak, even when repackaged in a modern form by American spiritualists. And therefore, scientists, doctors, and the clergy, exemplars of Victorian respectability and common sense, they turned their skeptical attention to table turning. Even Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the fictional paragon of Victorian rationalism, experimented with table turning. So after controlling for trickery and deception, our common sense heroes proposed various theories. And the clergy, skeptical of heresy rather than the spirit world, denounced it as devil worship. The more scientifically minded turned to invisible forces, such as the recently discovered electromagnetism, galvanic forces, or even animal magnetism, the force that was believed by some to explain hypnosis. The scientific community by the Victorian era was fully reconciled to the existence of invisible forces. Newton's hugely successful theory of gravity proposed an invisible force that influenced the motion of bodies at a distance without intervening mechanical medium of transmission. And Michael Faraday's pioneering experiments at the Royal Institution in London revealed the existence of electric and magnetic forces that extended into empty space. And if humanity had for millennia failed to notice such things, then perhaps there were many, many more. And so other more speculative hypotheses were advanced to explain table turning, such as ectinic or ectoplasmic force, a precursor to the theory of psychokinesis, and odic forces, named after the god Odin, which was a vitalist analogue of electromagnetism. Yet common to all these investigations is that no one denied the reality of the phenomenon. The skeptics just differed regarding the true cause of it. And that's because the tables really did turn, even when the skeptics were in control. Victorian England was faced with an epidemic of ghostly spirits, not emerging from the London fog or out of the corner of your eye, but in full view, manifesting in the homes of anyone inclined to invite them. So who could get to the bottom of all this? What person had the right combination of expertise in mysterious phenomena, yet sufficient scientific acumen? Victorian society needed a real-life Sherlock Holmes, and they found it in Michael Faraday. His experiments had discovered new hidden forces. He could induce magnetic fields by harnessing the power of electricity, and he built and demonstrated marvelous rotary devices that seemed to move of their own accord. Faraday was therefore asked to solve the mystery of table turning. He began by attending seances to witness table turning for himself. That convinced him the phenomenon was real and not trickery, so he set to work. He covered a table with different insulating materials to prevent electrical or magnetic forces, and then asked volunteers to perform the seance in laboratory conditions. The table still moved, so electromagnetism as an explanation was out. Then in 1853, Faraday conducted an ingenious experiment. He placed glass rollers between two small boards that were fastened together so the upper board would slide left and right before the lower one moved. It's kind of like a lag. So any lateral force on the upper board would transmit to the lower board with a lag. And then he attached an upright haystalk that clearly waved with any lateral movement. And then he placed that entire apparatus on top of the wooden table. And then his volunteers began the seance and put their hands on top of the apparatus, which was on top of the table. And the table still moved, but before the table moved, the haystalk waved, indicating that their hands caused the table to move. Faraday proposed, therefore, that the volunteers were deceiving themselves by unknowingly moving their hands, and their unconscious minds, so to speak, wanted table turning to be true. And in fact, as soon as the participants realized that they themselves were moving the table became absolutely still. And Faraday concluded that table turning was a psychological, not a supernatural phenomenon, which he called the ideomotor effect. Faraday, as he then wryly observed, had managed to turn the tables on the table turners. But maybe he was being a bit too humble, for he had discovered a psychological social mechanism that explained the ancient phenomenon of ensouling objects. If Faraday was right, then humanity had been deceiving itself for millennia by unconsciously projecting its own belief systems outwards into the physical world, a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy or self-constructed confirmation bias. The statues or tables or the curling smoke from the incense burners do not host spirits, but are imagination. Seemingly a success for Victorian science, the haunting epidemic could be safely ignored. But could Victorian science also solve the mystery of the haunted commodity with its ghostly objectivity? That was certainly Marx's intention. He had asserted that a labour value is a property of a commodity but could not be found in it. And he also asserted that a labour value could change due to changes in the productivity of labour occurring even hundreds of miles away. So Marx needed to explain himself to his readers, and that was no easy matter. The first part of Capital, where Marx explains value, is difficult, and Marx reworked it many times. To try to explain himself, Marx draws an analogy with Newtonian gravity. For example, he states, begin quote, "In the midst of all the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labour time socially necessary for their production forcibly asserts itself like an overriding law of nature. The law of gravity thus asserts itself when a house falls about our ears. The determination of the magnitude of value by labour time is therefore a secret, hidden under the apparent fluctuations in the relative values, that is, labour values of commodities. So, end quote. So the law of value is like the law of gravity. A bird flies, shelves stay up, but gravity is always working away behind the scenes. Eventually the bird will fall and the books will tumble. Similarly, prices may deviate significantly from their underlying labour values, but this can't persist for too long because real material costs of production eventually assert themselves in the market, often in the form of sudden crises. So he compares the law of value to the law of gravity. He also compares labour value to mass. He writes, begin quote, "As labour values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labour time," end quote. And he also draws an analogy between exchange ratios and weight. For example, 100 loaves may weigh the same as 1 kilogram of iron because they have the same mass. Similarly, 40 yards of linen are worth 2 coats because they both have the same labour value. And after making this point, Marx writes, begin quote, "Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron in the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely their weight. But the coat, in the expression of value of the linen, represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely their value." End quote. So Marx didn't pursue that analogy further, but we can. So bear with me for a moment. An object with a mass has a weight in virtue of the local gravitational field in which it's placed. If we change that surrounding field by transporting the object to the moon, then the very same mass will have a different weight. And weight cannot be found in an object, no matter how closely we examine it, because weight is a force that acts upon the mass. But even though we can't find weight in the mass, nonetheless weight is a property of it. So, does a mass really have a weight? We say it does, although that's not fully accurate. It's shorthand, because weight is really a relation between a mass, a local gravitational field, and the law of attraction. So we have a property of an object that is not a property of the object in itself. And I'm going to call that kind of property a field property. And it was Faraday who, in 1849, first coined the term field to explain the results of his experiments with magnetism and electricity. For example, he placed a paper sheet coated with a thin layer of melted wax on a bar magnet and then gently peppered the wax with iron filings. It's an experiment probably all done at school. Magnetic force aligned the filings to reveal the invisible lines of force. He let the wax cool, yielded a frozen picture of the magnetic field. Another example, Faraday built a spherical capacitor made of 2 brass spheres, one placed inside the other. He induced a positive charge on the outer sphere by charging the inner sphere with an electric current. He then measured the electrostatic force in the gap between the spheres, which demonstrated the existence of an invisible electric field that extended beyond the metal itself. So just as a mass in the gravitational field is subject to a force called weight, a metal in a magnetic field is subject to a force with a magnetic force, a charged particle in an electric field is subject to electrostatic force. Modern physics takes these field ideas even further. The ancient Greek philosopher Thales proposed that all things are full of gods. After observing the power of magnets to move iron and the power of amber when rubbed with animal fur to pick up straw, these spirits animate passive matter. But Faraday's breakthroughs explain the same phenomenon, not with anthropomorphic spirits, but with invisible fields. So Faraday had exercised the spirits from statues, tables, and also electromagnetic phenomena. Good Faraday also helped to exercise the ghostly objectivity of Marx's labour values. And I think undoubtedly he could have, if there ever had been a chance meeting in a London pub, because Marx, by drawing analogies with mass, weight, and the law of gravity, was already flirting with the concept of a field. So with the help of Faraday, let's complete the exercise. So a field associates a quantity with every point in a physical space. But the space doesn't have to be a spatial one. So I'd like you to imagine the state of technology in the world right now, at this moment in time, and think of the enormous variety of methods that we employ to produce the enormous variety of goods and services that we consume. Now imagine this economic state of affairs as a vast input-output network with nodes that represent commodity types and directed arrows which connect one node to another node that represent the fact that one commodity type might get used up when we produce another one. Mathematically, this network is a connected commodity space. Each node in the network is not a point in physical space, but a point in commodity space. And we can associate a vector, which is simply a list of numbers, with each point in commodity space. So, for instance, imagine the node labeled small three-legged wooden table. Let's say the first number associated with this point in commodity space is the average labor time directly supplied to produce this type of table. Let's say that's 2 hours, because average over all the different concrete methods of producing the table, it takes 2 hours to transform the raw materials into the finished article. And let's say the second number is the average quantity of wood directly used up. And let's say that's 40 board feet of timber. And the third number is the average quantity of glue. The fourth number is the quantity of metal studs that are used, and so on and so on and so on. All the inputs required, directly required to make that three-legged wooden table. And we do this for every commodity in the whole world. So we have this massive network. Each node in the network has a vector of numbers associated with it. That enormous network is identically what Marx calls the conditions of production. It's a social, not a physical field, and I'm going to call it a technology field. And to begin with, let's assume the technology field is static. Of course, it does change. Nodes and arrows wink in and out of existence with every birth or death of a commodity type or change in the methods of production. But just as physicists consider static fields before generalizing to dynamic fields, we'll do the same. So now, return again to our three-legged wooden table that's just been produced, ready for shipping to a warehouse. What is its labor value? Start at the table's node in the technology field and add to a running total the direct labor time used up to produce it, and then follow backwards all the input arrows to this node. So for example, we trace the 40 board feet of timber back to its node and add the direct labor time used up to produce this quantity of timber to our running total. And we do the same for the glue and for the metal studs and so on, each time adding to our running total. And we don't stop there. We also consider the commodities indirectly used up to produce the timber, the glue, the studs, and so on. And so we recursively trace all the input arrows backwards in the technology field, adding each direct labor time to our running total as we go. And eventually, this process will asymptote to a definite finite value, which represents the total direct and indirect labor time used up to produce this kind of table. And that is its labor value. And that means, quite simply, that labor value is also a field property. The labor value represents what Marx calls the total coexisting labor supplied to produce the table. And by coexisting, he means all the labor supplied in all the different branches of production that cooperatively produce the table and all the necessary direct and indirect inputs. And a labor value is a fraction of the social working day. Now, in electrostatics, the potential energy of a charged particle in a field is the work that would need to be done to move it from an infinite distance away to its present location in the field. And the labor value of a commodity in a technology field is the work that would need to be done to produce it from scratch. Labor values and potential energy are therefore very similar. Both are instantaneous properties of objects in a field that have mathematical representations in terms of integrals or sums over fields. And this is why Marx is inspired when he draws his analogy with gravity. A commodity has a labour value in virtue of the technology field in which it's embedded. And the labour value cannot be found in the commodity, no matter how closely we examine it, because labour value is a field property. And just as an electric field governs the movement of a charged particle, and a gravitational field governs the movement of masses due to laws of gravity, a technology field governs the trajectory of a commodity's market price due to the law of value. And in all cases, an underlying field property manifests as potential or actual motion of those things under its influence. It's the hidden principle of movement and animation. So, does a commodity really have a labour value? Yes, but we have to be very clear what we mean by that, because its labour value is, again, a relation between a commodity type, the local technology field, and the law of value. A commodity really is congealed labour time because it really is material wealth that, if destroyed, would require a definite quantity of labour time to recreate it. But that quantity is a property of the technology field in which the commodity is embedded. So a labour value is not literally embodied in the commodity like wine poured into a bottle. It's more like a genie in a bottle. And Faraday's field concept also helps us to exercise any spooky action at a distance in Marx's theory. So again, the wooden table, but now it's been stored in a warehouse unsold for over a year. And in the meantime, the technology field has changed. The world now employs more efficient techniques to make these kinds of tables. So as a result, the labour value of the table has decreased. Now, the labour value of the table stored in a warehouse immediately alters with every change in the technology field, but without the need for any causal process or medium of transmission, for the simple reason that its labour value is a field property. The change actually occurs in the technology field. Nothing happens in the material body of the commodity, but such field changes immediately begin to have causal consequences. Because the change in the technology field modifies the attractor of the law of value. The markets start to converge to this new attractor state. The price of unsold tables and newly produced tables of the same kind start to decline relative to other commodities because less of society's labour time is now needed to produce them. And if demand for such tables remained constant, then some proportion of society's working day will eventually be reallocated to other activities. So the change in the labour value of an already produced commodity doesn't require action at a distance, no more than it would that a change in the status of a person from married to divorced due to a legal act that happens to occur many hundreds of miles away. In both cases, the full causal consequences do not immediately manifest. Labour values do have a ghostly objectivity, not because they are ineffable or pure social constructs, but because they are hidden properties of the totality of our conditions of production that, in ordinary life, only manifest to our senses in the distorted and mysterious form of exchange value. So let me bring this story to a close. Victorian skepticism, especially Faraday's contributions, revealed that ensouled objects are the creations of our own minds. In 1888, the Fox sisters admitted that table turning was a hoax. The occult power that sent tables rocking and knocking across 2 continents had a human, not a supernatural origin. Spirit summoning was either a conscious lie to deceive others or an unconscious lie to deceive oneself. The old enchantments were dying. But Victorian skepticism did not extend to the value form itself. As Marx remarked, in the religious world, begin quote, the productions of the human brain appear as independent beings endowed with life and entering into relation both with one another and the human race. So it is in the world of commodities with the products of men's hands. This I call the fetishism which attaches itself to the products of labour so soon as they are produced as commodities, end quote. And a fetish is an inanimate object that we worship because we think it's inhabited by a spirit. And the emerging science of economics was fully enchanted by the fetish of the value form, thinking it transcendentally real rather than an immanent creation of our own social activity. Again, as Marx wrote, begin quote, political economy has never once asked the question why labour is represented by the value of its product and labour time by the magnitude of that value. These formulae appear to the bourgeois intellect to be as much a self-evident necessity imposed by nature as productive labour itself, end quote. And we inherit this bourgeois hubris of a scientific and commercial rationality that thinks itself free of all superstition. But capitalism has its own darker enchantment, because we daily perform a mass ritual that ensouls every object and activity in the world with a property called economic value. And the movement of these numbers, not under our conscious control, govern our lives just as much as the ancient gods once did. We're not free of spirits, but we remain haunted by them. Now, my grandparents were full of ghost stories. They always believed there was more to reality than met the eye. But my grandfather never trusted the gypsy table. His first act after he recovered from the death of my grandmother was to take an axe to the table, chop it to pieces and burn it. At the time I was shocked, but now I understand that he just wanted to free himself of the spirit that haunted his home. End of story. Thank you.